essentially work that we've been doing with my very close collaborator Olivier Bénichou. So we are just downhill in Jussieu. And so this involved quite a few students and collaborators, and one of them is Mathieu Copé, who was involved at the early stages of the work some almost 10 years ago. And it also involved a collaboration with Yossi Klafter at the beginning. So it's a group of theorists, so I present to you mostly theoretical work, but I will also present some experimental data, and most of it comes from the group of Maxime Dahan, who is now here, and Xavier Darzac, who was around as well. So let me start with very briefly stating the main questions that I want to discuss. So it's a very, very simple question. I'll be dealing with one particle problem. And so typically the question that I want to ask is I'll be considering one searcher. So my searcher is my green guy here. And this will be a random searcher. A random searcher means a searcher that performs some kind of random walk. I'll make it more precise. And this searcher moves in the presence of a target, which is a red guy here, which will be mostly fixed in what I will discuss. And the question we want to address is how long does it take the searcher to find the target, okay? So in the random walk language, I will call this search time a first passage time, because I will assume that the target is found typically upon the first encounter. So as soon as my searcher steps on the target is found. So why do I want to discuss such things? Typically because you can think of many examples of processes that will be limited by this kind of first encounters between random particles. So the most obvious is at the molecular scale. So in the case where my searcher is a molecule that has to react with some reaction partner, if you're in a regime which is extremely dilute, then the limiting step of your reaction kinetics will be this transport step and the time needed for the particle to encounter before they can in fact react. And this kind of dilute regime, typically you will get nice examples in the context of cell biology. If you think of a typical chemical step in transcription, you will have a reaction partner which will be a gene, and you can have a single of this guy. So one of the reactions will have a concentration which is not even defined. It's only one particle. And in some examples, this can be activated by a very, very small amount of molecules. So in that case, typically, you're in a regime where the kinetics will be controlled by transport. And it's important to be able to have this kind of tools to quantify the reaction kinetics. In fact, over the years, we've been interested at this kind of search problems over different scales, because as a searcher, you could think of not necessarily a molecule, but it could be a larger searcher. And typical example, again, at larger scale, you can think of a bacteria or a cell that is looking for something, and this something can be food. Or in the case of cells, recently we've been interested in immune system cells whose function is to find typically pathogens in an organism. So in that case, again, you can relate a biological function, which is finding something, and the quantification of the efficiency of this function will amount to quantify search times. So that's why we will be dealing with this kind of search problems and the question of determining search times. So how to do it? As soon as your searcher is a random searcher, by definition, the search time is a random variable. Okay, so that's first very simple thing. And the first quantity that you might want to look at is the mean. So what is the average of this search time? And the first thing that you might need to know, if you consider the simple case of a Brownian searcher, so a typical usual Brownian motion, if your searcher moves in infinite space, typically take the one-dimensional case, you put one target, which will be here. You start somewhere on an infinite line. That would be my starting point. And then the mean of the search time to the target. So first, a priori, you're not completely sure that you will eventually find the target. In 1D, you're sure that you will eventually find the target. But if you compute in that case, if you try to compute in that case the mean of the first passage time, this quantity will be infinite, simply because the distribution of arrival time, and so I will need this f, which is the first passage density, so the probability that you will reach the target for the first time at time t. This guy at long times, so in 1D, scale has a power law, which in that case has no first moment. So in fact, you will always eventually find the target, but you will get very long trajectory that will get lost to infinity, and this will control the mean, which eventually will be infinite. So the mean of the search time in that very simple case, so that's for 1D Brownian motion. So if you want to compute a mean search time, that's why I will denote like that. So this is target, notation is bad, obviously. And this quantity is infinite in open space. And that would be the case in higher dimension as well. Okay? So if you want to quantify this kind of problems, in fact, they will be well posed only if you have a confined domain. So I'll be interested in this, this picture in the case where, in fact, my searcher can move only in a confined domain, and this confined domain will have a given shape and reflecting walls, so that you're sure that you will never get to infinity. And in that case, you have general arguments that state that the distribution has an exponential cutoff, so that everything is well defined in terms of moments. And then the main question that we want to ask is, okay, if I have a confined domain, I have a well-defined mean and well-defined moments, can I compute this quantity? And the question we want to discuss is how this quantity will depend on the geometry of the problem, so typically volume and where you start from and where is located the target. So that would be the first set of questions, determine the dependence on geometry and on the kind of search of random process that you consider. And then second question that comes in, if you're able to compute the mean, the mean is obviously an important quantity, but you need to be able to say whether or not it is the only time scale in your problem. And to answer that question, in fact, you will need to access the full distribution to quantify fluctuation and make sure that the main time scale in your problem is in the mean. And last, another question that will be around in the context of biological processes, you want to know if you're doing good, if the search is efficient or not. And in that context, you might want to try to minimize the search time to try to assess how efficient the process is in searching the target. So I will mostly focus on the example that comes from transcription kinetics, but I just want to give you orders of magnitude. And what you should keep in mind is a very, very simplified picture of transcription kinetics. So here I will typically consider a confined volume. So in case of eukaryotes, that would be my nucleus, or in the case of prokaryotes, that would be the whole cell. So it will have a volume that will be n here. And my typical searcher will be a given protein. It's a transcription factor whose function is to find a target site to activate a gene, let's say. Okay? And the picture is as simple as that. I will not go in the details of biochemistry of transcription. And I want to compute this activation time. And so a few orders of magnitude. Again, if you consider a typical genome, this is huge. And you want, typically among billions of base pairs, to find a single sequence which is extremely small. So if you think of this search problem, this is a very hard search problem because you need to find one target among billions. The searcher, the amount of searcher can be extremely small. This is hard to measure, actually, but in some cases, at least, there are evidence that you have, in some cases, a very low copy number, which means that it will be really controlled by the transport step and not by reaction itself. So we're really dealing with one searcher, typically, and one target. And then what makes it even more complicated is that the typical nuclear environment is a very complex medium, and so that you don't necessarily expect simple Brownian diffusion. So that's also something that we want to try to assess, how much the complexity of the environment in terms of crowding and potential binding to DNA, etc., how much this can affect the search process and change the kinetics. And to get a general picture, this process should be fast because all these transcription reactions, they are extremely important for the cell to function properly. So this should be fast, this should be efficient, and potentially regulated by different chemical processes. So that's the kind of questions that we want to understand. So as physicists, and more concretely, the concrete question that I will discuss is how can I compute a mean first passage time to a target in a confined volume? How this guy will depend on the geometry. So what happens if I change the volume? What happens if I change the starting position? Does it matter at all on the kinetics? So that's something that I want to discuss. And how all this will depend on the kind of transport process. If I do the same problem in, let's say, a very dilute solution in 3D, or if I look at the same problem in a very crowded environment, do I get the same typical properties? So that's also something that I want to discuss. And beyond the mean of the search time, as I said, I will discuss the existence of other timescale, because again, you could have a broad spectrum of timescale, and in that case, it's very important to be aware of how this is distributed if you want to quantify, for example, the fluctuation of the search time that can have an important role in the biological process. So let me just come back to this problem of the existence of other timescale. In fact, you can rephrase this problem in terms of classical chemistry, because from what I said, the typical process that I want to look at is having a protein that wants to find a target to activate the target. So if you just look at that, you have a one-step chemical process, and from classical chemistry, you expect that the concentration of your protein should decay exponentially, okay? One step, first order equation, you should get something which is exponentially decaying. So how can you, in fact, translate these problems in terms of single particle problem? Because that's the picture where you have a concentration field, okay? So you have infinitely many molecules in your system, approximately, and so you can describe correctly the system by a concentration. Now, what happens if you have one of them and one single target? How can you do that? And in fact, you have a direct mapping between the problem that I can even write down. So if you have a concentration, so the typical problem that you want to solve is that you have a concentration of proteins that are diffusing molecules. So the concentration field of your protein, it will satisfy a diffusion equation. Okay, so that's my CP, so that's my concentration of protein at point R and time t. And then I have boundary conditions that will be important here because I'm in a confinement. What I want to say is that the concentration at time equals 0, that's my initial condition. So I assume that I have a homogeneous condition, so that's a choice so far. And what I want is that the concentration at the target, whatever time is, this is 0, which means that as soon as I reach the target, I have a reaction. And I want that my protein, my molecules will not escape the volume, so I want to have no flux at the boundary. And this for any time should be 0. So no flux at the boundary, which means reflecting wall. I have an absorbing condition at the target, and I start with a flat profile. Yes?
Sorry. First, you said about Brownian motion.
Yes.
Search processes and this random search.
Yes.
And now you give an example of protein acting on a substrate, but this is, as I remember, is governed by theory of transition state when the height of activation barrier plays much higher role than diffusion. So
it depends.
Diffusion and activation barriers are kind of.
You have two time scale. If you have, again, you have two time scale in the problem. The first time scale is the time scale of transport, which will be typically the time scale that I will consider. And if the regime is dilute enough, this kind of time scale would be much longer than the activation time scale that you're mentioning, which is the local chemistry of rearranging wave function. And typically, you have an activation barrier to cross. And this is a given time scale that I will assume is much faster than the transport time scale.
So you are concentrating on the search.
On the transport part, yes. And when it's extremely dilute, which is the case when you have a single molecule, if you have a single molecule, then the activation step is much faster, at least in some cases. So here, it's really the transport that will matter. And so just to make the parallel, and that will lead me to introduce some useful definition for later on. Now what happens for the one particle problem. In fact, what you can show, and I will not do it explicitly, but a useful quantity is what is called the survival probability. And this survival probability is the probability that your single searcher has not yet found the target at time t. Okay? So it is easy to write down in terms of this first passage distribution. It's simply the probability that you will in fact find the target later. Okay? So these two guys are related, and this survival probability, so that's a single particle quantity. This survival probability, in fact, it satisfies the diffusion equation. Formally, the difference is that here, that's the starting position. It's the probability to still be alive, knowing that you started from a given R0. But formally, again, it is a simple diffusion equation. That's not hard to show, but I don't have time here. It's called the backward equation because now the diffusion operator acts on the starting position, but formally, you have here a diffusion equation, which is exactly the same as the one you would get for a full concentration field of your particles. And in fact, you can check that you even need to satisfy the same boundary condition because the survival probability at time 0, wherever you start, you're sure that you will be alive because that's by definition your starting position. So this is 1. And the survival, if you start from the target, this is 0, because if you start from the target, you die by definition. Dying means finding here. And you have also a no-flux condition at the boundary. So you see that, I mean, it's not always easy to keep that in mind, but in fact, formally, the problem for a full concentration of particle is exactly the same problem as the single particle problem. So if now you follow textbook kinetics tells you that if you have a one-step equation, the concentration field should be a single exponential. So in my one particle language, this statement would be that S, so first order kinetics, it would mean that S of t, my survival probability, is a single exponential. And that's what I want to discuss. So in fact, the question of determining whether or not you follow first order kinetics amounts to compute the survival probability, which is up to an integral, the first passage density. So that's exactly what I want to discuss. So concretely, I will start with this theoretical, rather technical aspects of really answering this question, and then I will switch to application to transcription kinetics, where I will show you some data to try to illustrate what we can do. So let's start with this problem again. So I have a random searcher starting from a given position, and I want to estimate the first passage event at a given target in a bounded domain. So a little bit of background, and again, this is a kind of an important example. This kind of problem can be solved rather easily in one dimension. And the usual technique that you have to solve this problem is what is called the backward equation, which you have written here. In fact, it's a simple Poisson equation. So that's for the mean first passage time at the target starting from S, with boundary conditions that are obvious. If you start right at the target spot, the time is 0, and you want a reflecting boundary to conserve not to let the particle escape. And in fact, this equation, it follows very simply from this problem. I can even show it to you on the board. So here I consider a very simple 1D problem that I will make discrete to make it simple. So I have a lattice walk. At each time step, I make a step either left or right. And I want to compute the mean time starting from, let's say, this site S. I want to compute the mean time to reach the target starting from S. How can I do that? So what kind of equation do I get? In fact, if you make a partition over the first step of the process, it is very easy. If you consider that S is not right next to the target, whatever happens, you will perform a step. So the clock ticks. So you have 1. It means that you made a step anyway. And then with probability 1/2, you will end up at S minus 1. And then the remaining time is t starting from S minus 1. And with probability 1/2, you will end up at s plus 1, and the remaining time averaged will be this guy. Okay? So you have this extremely simple equation here in 1D, but you can do it in any dimension, is pretty much the same. And if you put this guy here and the 1 on the other side, you get Laplace equals -1. Okay? So that's how you typically derive this equation. So formally, for the mean, you have a well-defined problem, at least for Brownian motion, where you know the transport operator, which is this kind of Poisson equation. What makes it a bit tricky is that you have mixed boundary conditions. So in given domains in higher dimension, you cannot solve it formally. And since I'm at this stage, it's useful to solve it explicitly in 1D so that you get an idea of what happens. Let me do that in a continuous limit. So I have a Brownian motion in continuous space now. So exactly this geometry. And then what you need to solve, so to make it well dimensionized, you have a diffusion coefficient here. And so that's the very same equation, except that I need a diffusion coefficient to have the proper dimension. And that's what I need to solve with the mean search time starting at x position 0 means the target, this is 0, and dxt starting at, let me say that this guy is L. This should be 0 because I have a reflecting wall. So this is extremely easy to solve. And you have explicitly what you want of x. So this should be x. For symmetry reason, it should be like that. And here you should have a d. And to make it correct, you should have a 2 here. So here you have explicitly your quantity of interest. So what I want to stress here is that here, it's not so trivial. And why is it not so trivial? It's because in your problem, you have in fact two length scales. So you see that by dimensional analysis, the time should be a length squared over d. Okay? The point here is that you have two length scales. So a priori, it's not easy to say that at least for small x, this guy goes like xl over d. And so the fact that the length squared is x times l, this is not something that you can that you can tell right away. So the very naive, I'm not saying that's what you would have answered. The very naive answer would be to say, okay, I'm at a distance x, so a typical diffusion time would be x squared over d. And this is not true. This is not true because, in fact, you will have trajectory that will explore the rest of the domain, and this will scale with L, and this scaling with L is not so easy. So that's the first example that tells you that the mean, in fact, in that one-dimensional case, it's not trivial because you have two time scales. You have one time scale, which is the diffusion over the length x, which is x squared over d. And you also have the long time scale, which is L squared over d, which is the time to cover the whole domain. And in the mean, you have a mixture of both, which is non-trivial. And I'll come in more precisely to this point in other examples. But that's the first result that is important to know. So in the literature, what else do we have as exact results? You have very nice results that come, in fact, from the 60s from Elliott-Montrol, who was dealing with averages of the search time, but averaged over the starting position. So you will lose the information of how does it depend on where you start, how does it depend on where the target is. But these are problems that can be exactly solved. And I can give you the answer because, again, this is something that will be important. So Montrol, you have generic scaling, so for the mean, but averaged, this bar means that you average over the starting position. So that gives you a single time scale in your problem. And this depends on space dimension. So this is for lattice random walk, and it scales like n squared. So n is the number of sites in your domain. So it's n squared in 1D. It's n log n in 2D, and it's n in 3D. And why is it important? Because already from this, you can start discussing the efficiency. Because you see that the efficiency is not the same. The scaling with volume is different depending on the dimension. And you see that in low dimension, you scale like n squared, which means that you're not doing so good with respect to the volume. If you want to find the target, you will need a time which on average scales like n squared. If you compare to 3D, 3D is interesting because here you scale linearly with n. And you can already compare the scaling with what would happen in the case of a smart strategy. Smart meaning that you think of what you do. And what would you do to find a target in an open space? At least what you would do is not come back to the steps that you've already visited. So the first smart strategy is to consider self-avoiding strategy to make sure that you do not revisit the same spots. And in fact, when you do that, you find the same scaling. So any smart strategy, if you have no information at all about the target is, the smart strategy in 3D will scale the same as the completely stupid diffusive strategy. You gain prefactors, but you do not change the scaling. But this is true only in 3D. And you see that this is critical on the dimension. In low dimension, if you're smart, you will gain a lot. But in high dimension, in fact, you don't get so much. That's a first outcome of this. I'll come back to this scaling. And last, before going to what we've done, and another nice result, which is extremely general. It's due to CAD, so it's a very old result. It concerns return times. If you start right next to the target, the mean time to come back is in fact, no matter what kind of structure you're moving on, it's exactly the number of accessible sites. This could be any kind of graph, whatever you like, any space dimension. This is always exactly the number of accessible sites. This is a completely general result. Yes?
I have a question. How can you be smart in 1D? Because if you avoid, basically if you avoid taking the same step twice, you can never go back.
Yes, self-avoiding in 1D is not so easy.
Okay.
It's not so easy to be extremely smart because you need to know what direction to start. So
okay.
But anyway, even if you know, because even if you go in the wrong direction, you will still so smart would be going ballistic. If you go ballistic, you will scale like n. It's hard to be much smarter than that. Okay, so now let's move to what can be done in the general case. So in the general case, what I present is what you can do in the case where the work is Markovian. So Markov would mean that I consider a searcher that has no memory. And in that case, if the searcher has no memory, you have a simple relationship between what is called the propagator, which is the probability of being somewhere at time t. And this is connected to my first passage density. So here P is the same as my F here. I'm sorry about that. So that's the probability to reach the target for the first time at T prime. And you have a simple convolution. It simply tells you that if you're at the target at time t, it means that there exists an intermediate time where you reach the target for the first time. And then you sum over all this intermediate time. And you get this simple convolution. So that relates the propagator to the first passage density, which is something which is useful. And it's useful because from that equation, you can have an explicit expression for the mean search time, which will be completely independent on the volume. If you take the large volume asymptotics from this equation, you can show that the mean search time will scale linearly with the volume, and you factorize out all the dependence on the volume of the problem, and all the dependence on the position with respect to the target will lie in this object, which is called a green function, and which is an object in infinite space, which is far easier to compute. So by doing that, you reduce the problem to, in fact, having information about the transport process in infinite space, which is far easier than dealing with a problem in a bounded domain. So first you have the scaling in the volume, and now you need to estimate this quantity, which is called a green function for the random process. And for that, we will need to make some assumption. We cannot consider any kind of process. And what I want, yes, no.
In the case of Markov processes that you were mentioning now, that equation for the mean value of the first passage time,
yes,
it's the same, but with the Laplacian.
That would be it's the same here. In fact, what you have. So if you have a generic equation for the propagator with an operator here,
right.
Here that would be L dagger, the adjoint operator acting on T.
That one above is the Fokker-Planck equation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a backward equation, which means that you... Okay, so I need information, and at least I need to make an assumption on the process itself, and the simple cases that I want to discuss is the case of scale invariant processes. And that will be, in particular, the case of diffusion. And so I will characterize the random processes that I'm discussing by 2 dimensions. So this I won't be needing anymore. And these 2 dimensions are, so the first one is what is called the fractal dimension of space. So it simply tells you that the accessible space scales as a power law as a function of a distance. Okay? So if you have a sphere within this of radius r, within this sphere, the accessible volume will scale like r to the power df. In Euclidean space, that's the usual space dimensions. No big deal here. And the second one is a dynamic exponent that tells me how, for the process I consider, I relate space and time. And this is what is called the walk dimension, which is here. So for random walk, this guy is 2, because the mean square displacement is linear with time. And I will assume that I have a power law relationship between distance and time. And this is characterized by what is called the walk dimension here. So in particular, that covers Brownian motion in different Euclidean dimension. And it also, that's what I would be interested in, covers diffusion on fractal objects, like this object that will be a percolation cluster, which is defined as just a space where you put randomly obstacles. And for a given density of obstacles that reaches a critical threshold, if you have enough of them, you start having something which will be subdiffusive with an exponent here that will be different from 1. Okay? So in particular, yes?
Are we always considering the case where TF is smaller than DW?
No, and that's my next slide.
Oh, okay.
So we have these two. So typically diffusion on fractal objects. It needs to be Markovian, but then you can be on any kind of structure potentially with important crowding effects. That's the main point. And in that case, usually the propagator can be written like that with a scaling function. So typically everything that it says is that you have a scaling function that respects the scaling of distance with time, and these prefactors in fact only come from normalization. So I'm just considering scale invariant function for the infinite space propagator. And then I need to discuss exactly what you said, and that will bring me to Polya theorem, is that you have 2 very important different classes of transport processes, which is very related to what I discussed with respect to the dependence on dimension. Something happens when the dimension of the walk will be the dimension of the fractal space. So typically, you know that for Brownian diffusion, something happens for d equals to 2. Okay? In 2 dimensions, the Brownian motion becomes different. If you're in low dimension or if you're in high dimension, it becomes different. Different in which sense? So typically, what people call non-compact or transient transport. So it's the case where the walk dimension is smaller than the fractal dimension. So keep that in mind. Non-compact, that would be typically diffusion in 3D. Okay. And the picture that you need to get is that for non-compact transport, in fact, the searcher will leave many sites unvisited in the domain. And a way to quantify that is to look at the probability to eventually reach a given site. So the probability in infinite space to reach a target, this quantity will be strictly smaller than 1, which means that you have a chance never to find a target in that case. And this is equivalent to saying that if you consider a given site, the mean number of visits will be finite. Okay? So it means that you're not redundant. You explore space in a way which is not dense, and you leave many sites unvisited along your way. And so that's typically diffusion in 3D. And qualitatively, that will be very different from what you get from diffusion in low dimension. So typically diffusion in 1D. So we are in that case where the walk dimension, so for diffusion it's 2 larger than 1 in 1D. And in that case you have the opposite. The mean number of visits to a single site is infinite. It means that you come back infinitely often to the same spot, and you're sure with probability 1 you will visit any site in infinite space. So you come back and come back very, very often. And this is true not only for Brownian diffusion in Euclidean spaces, it's also true for random walks on generic fractals. And so the point is to compare these 2 dimension, because qualitatively it changes many things, and that would be related to what I was saying here. Yes?
I'm sorry, you got me confused. You're talking about general dimensions, and so generalized
random walks and diffusion now.
Yes.
But the equation you wrote earlier was just a diffusion equation.
Yes,
That
so
was just an example.
that was just an example. That was just an example, and you see that typically you're right. Here, if I want to consider a generic transport process with general dimension, I do not have my transport operator explicitly. So I cannot just solve a differential equation.
Exactly, are your assumptions?
Exactly, my assumption is what was written here, is that I have a Markov process which is scale invariant, which means that I know that the propagator is a scaling function. I don't know the transport operator, but I know that the process is scale invariant, which means that I know that the infinite space propagator is a scaling function of position and time.
You assume infinitely large space.
I assume that the process is defined in infinitely large space, and that what will control my properties in confinement.
Okay.
But I assume that the process is infinite space follows this rule.
Does this usually hold? What kind of system do you need for that?
Typically, it's hold for diffusion. It's hold for diffusion on fractals. So on percolation cluster, on a different example of fractals, that will hold. So that's why it's used when you try to model Schrödinger effect at static Schrödinger. If you start putting obstacles in the system, you reach a threshold at criticality where you have all these scaling functions.
Does it hold like for diffusion in cells?
Of course, this kind of scaling, so this will be convenient to do stuff analytically. I don't expect at all to have this scaling hold for a very large range of length scale, obviously. But we'll see that even if it holds transiently over some kind of length scale, then it can be enough to have striking differences. But of course, you don't expect this to be exact at all times and length scale in cells. So from that, what you get is the scaling of the mean as a function of distance now. So I already showed you that it was linear in the volume. And then I can extract from the previous scaling of the propagator the dependence on distance. And what matters is that, again, as I said, qualitatively, you have two very, very different scalings. So if the transport process is non-compact, so again, think of diffusion in 3D, what you have is that the mean search time will pretty much not depend on where you start. So you could start anywhere. You would get the same value of the mean search time. And as opposed to the compact case, so again, think of diffusion in low-dimensional spaces, like one dimension or fractals. In that case, you will have a very strong dependence on the position of the target and the starting point. Because here you see that you have a positive power, which means that typically you will strongly depend on R, whereas in the non-compact case, you have here a negative power, which means that in fact you forget very early about the initial position. So qualitatively, the mean search time will have a very, very different behavior with the position. So let me give you examples now. So the first example is 3D simple diffusion. So in that case, I can apply my scaling. So I expect something which is linear in the volume. So that's something that you can check. So here, that's the time rescaled by the volume. And what you expect, so the green function in finite space for diffusion is well known. So it goes like 1 over R. And you even have the prefactor, and that's something that you can check. And when you do that, so that's numerical simulation. In fact, it's not so large volumes. What you find is that indeed you have this kind of scaling like 1 over R. And what matters again is that you reach a plateau. So in fact, so here it's a lattice size, which means that the target has a size 1. And you see that after a few target sizes, you completely forget about the initial position. So you could start from anywhere. The search time would be the same in the case of 3D simple diffusion. So now let's make it more fancy. So I'm not at all talking about the nucleus here, but this would be true for other example of scale invariant process. Another example of scale invariant process is what is called a Levy flight. So here I still consider a random walk, but each step is not a step of length 1. The length of my step is distributed according to a power law. So by construction, this process is scale invariant. It has a walk dimension, which is a parameter of my power law here. So it fulfills all the criteria that I had. It's just another example of random walk, which is non-compact, because here in that case, you can make very large jumps, and that prevents you from stepping back onto your own step, so you do not oversample space. So it's very, very non-compact. You can play the same game, plotting a mean search time, and you see that again here you reach a plateau extremely fast, which means that no matter where you start from, the mean search time will be the same in that case. That's just another example. And let me move to the case of compact exploration. So that's the case where of diffusion in low-dimensional space. So again, you can think of diffusion in 1D, but a less trivial example would be the case of diffusion on fractals. So again, it's a very simplified view of random walk in a disordered crowded environment. So here, the picture is that you start from your open space and you start throwing obstacles completely randomly in your medium. These obstacles are fixed, and at some concentration of obstacles, you reach what is called a percolation cluster, and the available space becomes fractal. So it's characterized by a fractal dimension which is known. And if you have a random walker on this structure, you have a walk dimension which is also known. And this kind of motion is a compact exploration because the walk dimension is larger than the fractal dimension. Typically, you have this kind of labyrinth with many dead ends, and you come back very often to the same position. And again, you play the same game, and the scaling that you get is qualitatively very different because you see that now the mean search time will strongly depend on where you start. So that the distance between source and target, and that's really a quantity that will control the search kinetics. So geometry becomes important in that case of compact exploration. So that's sort of the main message for this problem for scale invariant process. That's really the compact versus non-compact features of the transport that tells you if geometry is important for the kinetics. So that was for the mean. So let me now discuss the fluctuations. So as I said, you might have other time scale in your problem. To look at that, you need to look at the higher moments. So here I don't give the calculation, but typically what you find is, again, that the higher moments will have a very different scaling with the volume and position depending on the nature of transport, non-compact or compact. And what you find is that the fluctuation in the non-compact case, so again, that would be diffusion in 3D. And let me write down compact so that you keep it in mind. So that would be fractals or 1D. So in the case of non-compact transport, you find that the scale fluctuation are of order 1. Okay? So that could be compatible with first-order kinetics. If you had an exponential law, that would be okay. However, in the compact case, what you find is that the fluctuation can get extremely large. And what you find is that they depend on where you start. And you see that if you start close to the target, you can start having extremely large fluctuations. So in that case, that means that something will happen which shouldn't be like a single exponential because you can tune the fluctuation and get extremely large fluctuation depending on where you start. And that's something that you can confirm by looking at the full distribution. From the moment you can reconstruct the full distribution. And in fact, the full distribution has a simple structure. So here, that the distribution of the first passage time, and it's a rescaled time. Here you rescaled the time by the mean average over the starting position. So it's just a way of rescaling time, so think of theta as a time. And in the large volume limit, what you find is that you have a very simple additive structure in the distribution. And what matters is that you have a dichotomy between long and short trajectories. So the delta function stands for very short trajectories that will be much shorter than your typical timescales. These have a weight. And then you have the complementary weight times a given function that gives you the distribution of the long trajectory. And in fact, what you can show is that this weight, as a simple interpretation, the weight of long trajectory is simply the probability that you will go to the boundary before going to the target. So in fact, you have two alternative choices. Either you go straight to the target, you have a given weight for that, which is the weight to reach the target before the boundary. And then you have very, very short time scales with a given weight. And then you have the weight, which is the probability to first go to the boundary and then to the target. And then you have a time that scales like the mean average over the starting position. So you have this very simple dichotomy. And all the game is to know the respective weight of very long and short trajectory to see how they combine and what kind of time scale you have in the problem. And that's my ugliest transparency. After that, I will switch to experimental data. Just to show you that you can compute this object, so the weights and the scaling functions. I don't want to comment on the explicit form. What matters again is that they are qualitatively very different depending on the nature of transport. So if it's non-compact, so for diffusion in 3D, what you find is that the weight of long trajectory is almost always 1. Which it means that no matter where you start, in fact, you have not this component of short trajectory, you have only long trajectory with a weight 1. And this guy is a single exponential. So typically, non-compact transport, you have a single exponential for this survival probability. Everything is fine. In the compact case, so diffusion on fractals or in 1D, what you find is that you can tune the respective weight of long and short trajectory. And in particular, if you start close to the target, you can completely kill the large time component, which means that you can enhance short time scale in your problem by playing with your initial position. And in that way, you will control completely the spectrum of time scale in your problem. And this function has a form which is not a single exponential, but it does not matter here.
Does it depend on how you define your boundary?
Here, it depends on the way you define, the way you send the boundary to infinity. So here I assume that any point of the boundary goes to infinity. If you remain close to a wall, you have And so just to make it more graphical, so here that's the survival probability that I defined earlier. So that's the probability that reaction has not occurred yet at time t. And again, what you find in the case of non-compact exploration, so typically diffusion in 3D, this survival probability is typically a function that will decay at a single time scale, and it's typically a single exponential. So here you have different colors for different starting position. You see that it does not matter where you start from, you will have a single decay, and this decay is completely contained in the mean. So it means typically that you have first order kinetics with a single exponential decay, and everything lies in the mean search time, and it means that it can even be average over space. You have a single time scale in your problem, which is a volume. In the compact case, so here that will be diffusion on a percolation cluster in a crowded environment. What you find is that depending on where you start, you see that the decay can cover a very broad spectrum of time scales, and these time scales are now completely controlled by the starting position. If you tune the starting position, you will tune the contribution of direct trajectories that gives you short time scales, and that way you can have a range of time scales that go from very short, which means in my 1D case that would be the x squared contribution, and they go up to the very large time scale, which goes like the volume of the domain. So you have a broad range of time scale, and this regime is now completely controlled by the geometry. So qualitatively, and again that's what I want to insist on, it's qualitatively different. As was asked earlier, I don't expect to have strictly valid power laws over extremely large ranges of times and length scale, at least in cellular media. That's clear. But if you have it over finite ranges, the qualitative difference could be seen. So you do not need to have all this hold over extremely large length scales. If it's compact at least over some length scale, then you can get the qualitative effect of having a contribution of short time scales. That's something that's important. So now let's go to less mathematical stuff and try to see how this could apply to transcription kinetics. So why do we believe that it can be important? So if we come back to my example of a transcription factor, so a protein that starts somewhere in the nucleus and that needs to activate a gene, typically you have two alternatives. Either diffusion in the nuclear medium is non-compact, so typically that would be diffusion in 3D. Assume that the nuclear medium is dilute enough so that you have a normal diffusion. Then typically we have this mean search time that is pretty much independent on where you start. And you have a single time scale in your problem, and this time scale as the accessible volume. So that would be R to the power 3 here. And that's typically first order kinetics. So if you want to be give a very brutal picture, you could put your DNA in a completely random order. As far as kinetics is concerned, the kinetics of regulation would be the same. You don't care about distances in that case. The second alternative is the case where you have compact exploration, at least over some length scale. And if you have compact exploration because the medium is crowded enough to get something which is close enough to a percolation threshold, for example, then qualitatively the mean search time will depend very strongly on where you start. So no position does matter a lot. And in addition, in your problem, you will have a very broad range of timescales that can be much smaller than the timescale of the mean search time average over the starting position. So in that case, you have a regime which is controlled by geometry. So now let's put that in the perspective of being efficient. As I told you, and it was already somewhere here, when you're so in 3D, in that case, I told you already that you would scale like the volume. And in fact, this is true for any non-compact transport. Here you scale as a volume, which means that you're doing good. You scale as a volume, it means that you're pretty much as efficient as you would be with a smart trajectory where you try to self-avoid, etc. So here with no cognition at all, if you're non-compact, you're doing good at large scale. If you're compact, you're doing bad because you're doing slower than smart trajectory because you scale as the walk dimension, which is larger by definition than the fractal dimension. So you're not good on average, but thanks to the geometry, if you start close enough, you can reach extremely short timescales. So you're on average bad, but if you play smartly with the position you start from, so if the geometric organization is well tuned, in that case, you can tune and have very short timescale emerge in your problem. So sort of a balance of both seems to be smart here. Yes?
So in the molecular environment, when it's very crowded,
Yeah.
the walls are thought to be moving every time you bang to the wall. So how can you define the fractal dimension of such a crowded medium?
You mean like a molecular liquid? Here, to get this kind of picture with a fractal structure, you need something which is fixed. So typically what people have in mind, it's for the nucleus where you have the chromatin and the DNA, which has a typical timescale of motion, which are much slower than the motion of the proteins themselves. So you have this picture of having chromatin, which is more or less fixed. And because it's a polymer, the typical conformation of polymers, depending on the simple model that you take, they typically have fractal scalings. So the people that serve arguments in favor of this fractal organization in the nucleus, they rely on that mostly. That chromatin is fixed and it's a polymer, so it could have a fractal organization at least over some length scale. If you take a molecular liquid, no chance. Okay, so now let's see what we can say experimentally. So that's typically what I just said. What happens in the nucleus, I mean, nobody really knows, but people are trying hard to determine whether or not the transport is compact or not, at least to characterize transport and characterize the available space, because it's important to determine these features. And so why would it be compact? So like transport on a fractal. So first, there are different techniques to try to determine the accessible space. So you can do a blunt image analysis of what is the chromatin. So you draw spheres and you count the mass within spheres. And some people measure fractal scaling at least over some length scales. You have people from polymer physics that tells you that anyway, if you have a polymer, you have some kind of fractal scaling within the polymer because it's a polymer. So it means that you start with monomers and you have a huge number of them. So you typically have a fractal scaling, whether you take equilibrium conformation or like fractal globule conformation. You have many models that predict fractal conformation of polymers and that people try to apply to chromatin. So these are arguments in favor of saying that you should have some kind of fractal environment in the nucleus. I'm not taking sides here, I'm just reporting what is said. So that's the effort which is made to try to determine some kind of fractal organization and fractal dimension of the nuclear space. And again, I'm not claiming that this fractal should be perfect over all length scales, no chance for that. If it is true, at least over some length scale, it could be sufficient to have the qualitative effect of compact transport. So that's first side, this static exponent, which is the fractal dimension. And then you want the dynamic exponent, which is characterizing the particle dynamics. And then for this, you need to do some single particle tracking to determine the scaling of position with time. And many people do that. I will just advertise what my colleagues do here. So in Maxime Daon's group. So typically, that's single particle tracking. So that's PALM experiment in a nucleus. All the game is to tune the fluorescence so that you can image a single one, not having many of them at the same time. So that's extremely hard stuff, and I'm not doing it at all, so I just show you data. So it's possible to track single protein inside the nucleus. That's the take-home message. You record trajectories, and from the trajectories, you try to figure out how you can relate space and time and try to see if you have a scaling. So by construction, the way you do the tracking, this trajectory cannot be long. They are heterogeneous, so it's very hard to have a clear-cut answer saying that, okay, I can define my walk dimension. But people are trying hard to get that.
So about this time scale, you said chromatin is roughly
doesn't move so much at the time scale of second.
Or is it improving?
That's people do the tracking of chromatin itself, and it moves at much larger time scale. Yes.
So what about the models or the theories about, let's say, transcription factories that doesn't really move in the nucleus and you know that about the
Yeah, I know this.
At one spot in the nucleus and the DNA comes to the factory to be transcribed.
That's you have also heterogeneities on top of it. Yes. Yeah, so that's more like some kind of rough coarse-grained scaling that is assumed. Then, of course, you have more specific and complex molecular architecture that are not taken into account. So just to come back to this game, so out of the track, so you have the track. Out of the track, you can measure what is typically a propagator, so the probability during a delta t to perform a given translocation. So you have this propagator. Out of the propagator, you can plot, for example, a mean square displacement and see how it relates with time. And the propagator, you can try the scaling argument that we argued. The main assumption of a scale invariant process would be that the propagator or the cumulative propagator is a function of this rescale parameter only. So you try to do that with the finite trajectory you get. And in that case, so that's an example of a fluorophore only. So it's a molecule that is not supposed to interact with anything. So it's supposed to be a free tracer particle in the nucleus. Okay, and again, supposed to because it's hard to make sure. And for this guy, which is supposed to be free, what you find is something that looks like free diffusion. Okay, so we're happy, not completely happy in fact, because when you do that, you see, okay, it's more or less diffusion. Again, I'm completely aware that here the time range is short, so getting power law over such a short time range is very dangerous. I'm aware of that, but that's, we cannot do much more for now. But what is a bit bothering is that when you look at the propagator, it's not really, it's not single Gaussian, because you have heterogeneity in the tracks, in the molecule you track, so you don't get a clean single Gaussian. So already the simplest experiment, which would be a free fluorophore, is not as simple as that. But at least these guys seem to diffuse normally and fast enough as compared to what you would get in solution. So it means that even if the nucleus is extremely crowded, if you track a particle that interacts with nothing, it moves rather fast. And now what you get if you take another one, which is about the same size, so it's not the size of the protein that is involved, but this guy is another example of a protein that interacts, so it's a positive transcription elongation factor. It binds to polymerase, so that's something that interacts indirectly with DNA, and if you repeat the same game, again, qualitatively, you have something which is quite different, much slower, and if you try to extract a dimension for this, you get something which is significantly larger, which tells you that it saturates, in fact, much more. So again, the trajectories are short, so it's really hard to be sure of this scaling, but at least qualitatively, it is very different, and so this one would be compatible with a compact explorer, so diffusing on something which is fractal-like. So the point, what I think is important, is that if you take two proteins that are about the same size, you change the affinity for DNA, and you have a qualitative, very big difference of behavior. So that tells you that transport can be tuned from the non-specific interaction with DNA. So that's the main take-home message that we can be sure of, because quantitatively, to try to sell this exponent, it's, at the present state, it's hard. But qualitatively, they are very different, and all this is controlled by non-specific interaction. And so let me comment on that, because in fact it comes back to an old story in the case of prokaryotes. So in the case of bacteria, the impact of non-specific interaction on the kinetics of search processes, that has been discussed a lot. In fact, it dates back to the 70s, where you had this early experiment made on the lac repressor, or where people in vitro measured search times for a specific target sequence. And what they seemed to find is that the search time that they observed was faster than what you would expect for simple 3D diffusion. So that made sort of a big fuss, and an idea that came early again in the 70s. Was the idea that in fact this protein that search for target, they don't only diffuse in 3D in the 3D medium, but they have a non-specific affinity for DNA, and they can bind to DNA. So they switch from 3D diffusion to a bound state where they can in fact diffuse along the DNA, so perform 1D diffusion, detach, etc., etc., etc. So this idea came in these early days, and people call that facilitated diffusion, which is a combination of 3D diffusion and 1D diffusion. So you don't have a single process which is scale invariant in the sense that I defined, but you combine two of them, and they had theoretical arguments saying that indeed it can be beneficial to alternate between both kind of transport, and that can induce short search time that could explain why they observe such efficient processes. So that again was in the late 70s, but this is something very hard to give evidence of experimentally. So the evidence came much later. And in fact, so you had the first set of evidence in this paper in 2007 in vivo in bacteria. And I, again, will advertise experiments that were done by Pierre Debiol right next door, in vitro this time, to try to evidence the fact that indeed you can have a combination of these two processes, which is 3D diffusion and 1D diffusion due to non-specific binding. So just a few words about the experiment. So it's in vitro. You have a stretched DNA, stretched by a flow along a plate, and you have a restriction enzyme that are supposed to have a non-specific affinity for DNA, which are fluorescent, and you do the tracking of the binding events of this guy along DNA. And so that's typically what you get, and you get tracks, and you can measure typically the mean square displacement, so x squared would be along the DNA axis, so the DNA would be here, you don't see it here. And so what you have, so in the transverse axis, you have the fluctuation of the DNA, so that would be the y squared, and if you look at the x squared, typically you do have diffusion along the DNA. So that was a proof that indeed your protein can bind to DNA non-specifically and can diffuse along the DNA strand. So it tells you that this sliding event exists. And what was much harder is to look at this kind of event, choc, and this choc is in fact, you can show that this event is much faster than what you would get from 1D diffusion if you look at the time scales. And so the point was to try to interpret these translocations, which are large and fast, as 3D translocation events. And in fact, when you analyze the distribution of these large translocation events, so what is the distance covered per translocation event, the distribution of this translocation, you can show that they fit with the distribution that you would compute for a Brownian particle that leaves a cylinder, so that would be your DNA. If you detach, diffuse in 3D, and rebind, you can compute the distribution of this rebinding spot. It looks like that. And with this distribution, you can fit the data. So it's a bit of an indirect proof, because you're never completely sure that it's not another guy coming whereas the first one left. But still, at this low concentration, this is supposed to be very unlikely. But what you observe here is at least compatible with the protein detaching, diffusing 3D, and coming back again. Okay? So these are kind of hard experiments to make, but now the common belief is that indeed this kind of facilitated diffusion reactive paths do exist, which combine 1D sliding and 3D excursion. So let me try to give you a hint of why is this good to do this kind of combination of 1D and 3D. And in fact, I will just discuss the simplest model for that, where you can calculate the search time in one line. So I will assume that I can in fact completely unfold my DNA, and I will not consider explicitly what happens when I diffuse in 3D. in fact, I will assume that the DNA conformation is such that when I leave the DNA in 3D, I can bind again the DNA at a location which is completely uncorrelated with the position that I left. Okay? So typically, I have a random enough conformation so that I don't have correlation in my 3D excursion. So if I do that, in fact, I don't care of the geometry of the 3D excursion. I just have to pay a time penalty that I call TOS3 here. And then I can bind the DNA, and when I bind the DNA, I diffuse in 1D during a time which would be TO1. And I alternate between these phases. If you want to compute a mean search time for that, in fact, it's very easy, because what you need to do is to say that, okay, I will have n iteration. An iteration means one sliding run and one 3D run. I need n of those. It's a random number, and each of them is a 1D time plus a 3D time. So the mean of this quantity is the mean number of iterations times the mean time needed for one iteration. And now in this expression, you just need to compute the mean number of attempts that you have to make. And the mean number of attempts is the inverse of the probability that one attempt is successful. And the probability that one attempt is successful is simply the span, which is exactly how much you scan in one sliding event over the total length. And so when you do that, you have explicitly the mean search time, and you can see right away from this expression that it is a non-monotonic function of the TO1 time, which is a sliding time. Okay, so it tells you that the mean search time in that case, in this very, very simple picture, you can tune the TO1, which is the non-specific affinity of your protein for DNA. You can tune it so that the mean search time will be minimized. Okay? It's advantageous to slide a little bit, but you should not slide for too long, because in that case you would be too slow, and there is an optimum value which is of the order of TO3. So that's, again, I think that the simplest way of seeing this, and that shows you that it can be beneficial to do both processes. And if you do that, you find orders of magnitude that are more or less compatible with observation. Okay, since I'm pretty much over time, I don't discuss that. And just to comment on why is it efficient and put that back in the perspective of what I said. So far I discussed compact versus non-compact processes. Here I have a combination of both. So how can I reconcile that? So again, for this facilitated diffusion, the 1D sliding is compact because it's 1D. So if you look at the mean time average over position, it's scaled like the system size squared. So L would be the length of DNA. But if you combine this 3D relocation, because of the 3D excursion, at very large scales, in fact, it becomes non-compact. So at large scale, it's non-compact, which is good because you're linear with the system size. So this is good because you have a low redundancy of exploration. But at short time scales, you can be compact. And why is that good to be compact? Because if you're compact, as I said, if you come back to the distribution, in fact, if you're compact, it means that you can, if you start close enough, you can completely kill the component of the long time scales. So, and that, in fact, what you find, you can redo the same study for facilitated diffusion. You can get the distribution of first passage time, of search times, and what you find is that indeed you have some compact feature. If you start close enough, because you're compact at short time scale, you can completely kill the long time scales component of your distribution, and in fact you take advantage of both sides, because on large scales you're good because you're linear with the volume. This is good and this is very hard to beat. You have no chance to be faster than that. And on the other hand, if you start close enough, you can completely kill the long time scale and take advantage of having extremely short time scale. So you sort of play on both sides. You're good at short time scale because you can be compact at short time scales, and you're good also at large time scales, at large distances because you're not compact. That's a way of seeing why it is good. And last, I don't want to bomb you with calculation, but just to say that this argument, in fact, is the argument of facilitated diffusion. I showed it to you in the case where the polymer is a single chain. In fact, it is true for pretty much any kind of polymer conformation that has a fractal structure. So it's not true only for linear chain. If you assume that your polymer is a fractal object, you can have the same story of binding and unbinding. So diffusing either on the polymer, whatever is the conformation, as soon as it's fractal, and then unbinding and diffusing 3D. This is beneficial no matter what is the polymer conformation. And this is to lead me to the last slide. So this facilitated diffusion picture, again, it was proposed more in the context of prokaryotes, and at least evidence, in vivo evidence, they come from prokaryotes and bacteria. So it's not so clear that it indeed exists in eukaryotes, so in the nucleus, because it's typically more packed, and it's not so clear that you can get 3 strands of DNA. And so I just want to show you some kind of first evidence that you have something which resembles facilitated diffusion even in a nuclear environment. So this is, again, an example of single particle tracking. So that was done here by Maxime Dahan in the nucleus. So they inject fluorescent proteins, and then they do the tracking. And you can look at the mean square displacement at early time and try to define different kind of population. And what they could find is that if you have an interaction, a non-specific interaction with DNA, you have a very slow population. And by playing with a drug, if you kill non-specific interaction, you can completely kill this slow peak. So you have a peak of the subpopulation, which seems to be bound to DNA non-specifically. So this you can identify. Okay, so here you cannot bind, so you only have the fast peak, and here you can bind to DNA non-specifically, and you have a very slow component. So that's population data. What was not clear is that you could indeed switch between both states, and that you can do by tracking, by looking at long enough tracks. If you look at the an instantaneous diffusion coefficient, you can identify phases where it is fast and phases where it is much slower. So here it's in log scale, which means that it's really much slower. And so from this data, these are first, at least, pieces of evidence that even in the nucleus, you can have this alternation between bound state on the chromatin, non-specific, and free diffusive state in 3D. So this is not completely clear yet, but at least that would be consistent with the fact that this kind of search strategies are efficient. And I think I should close here, so I won't speak about fluctuation in gene expression. And I will conclude just by thanking my collaborators, so mostly Olivier in Jussieu, and all the people involved over the last years. Thank you.
Okay, one or two quick questions. So I'll have a question. So you assume in all of this that basically cell prokaryotes or eukaryotes is infinite?
I mean, you assume that you can define the transport process in an infinite space, so that you can define this exponent, this scaling, yes.
So you don't assume any boundary effects will interfere. Do you know how realistic this is for the transcription?
I mean, you assume that you have scaling for the process itself, but when you compute times, you do have the finite size that matters. So in estimating times, you do need the volume, and that we take into account. But you assume that the process could be defined in infinite space with exponents that go over decades. But again, you need that for the calculation. We don't expect that to be true over all length scales. It is enough if it is true over some kind of length scale, then it's such a big qualitative difference that we think that something could be visible. Again, I'm not really on the side of people claiming that this should be a critical object with criticality that goes from a nanometer to meter.
No, but it's just whether it does change the general scale of the process in the same.
Yeah, I mean, this needs to be true the length scale that you're looking at, which is, let's say, 10 nanometers to the micron.
Yeah?
I have a question about the relation between the 2 dimensions you have.
Yes.
If you had like just one system full of like balls or something, and it's all the same kind.
Yes.
If you would look at those 2 dimensions, would they be the same?
2 dimensions, you mean the walk dimension and the fractal dimension? There is a connection between both, which is not trivial. But there is a connection, so if you take a given structure, and if you assume that you do a nearest neighbor walk on this structure, then you have a single possible walk dimension. So for a given structure, which has a fractal dimension, you have a single walk dimension that can be defined, but it's hard to actually compute. You need typically to do it numerically because it depends on the connectivity. The fractal dimension does not care so much about connectivity. You just need to count the available space. But depending on connectivity, you would get potentially different walk dimension. But the answer is yes. For a given structure, you have a single defined walk dimension, which is hard to compute, but which exists. Yes?
So in this mixed 3D 1D case, did you also look at the variance in the message time?
You mean for the facilitated?
Yeah, for
yeah.
It's not actually a realistic thing where you mix.
When you mix, I mean, under the assumption that the 3D is not really 3D, but just a time penalty that is exponentially distributed, yes, you can get the full distribution. So you have everything. But again, I mean, it's nice because you can do the calculation, but you definitely make a big assumption on what happens in the 3D relocation. But in that context, you can.
Awesome. Okay. So last question, and then we can go to coffee.
Yes. How established is it that for this 3D hopping,
yes,
the 1D, 3D diffusion, that this rebinding to DNA, is it really random, or how established is that it binds
the fact
specifically to any side?
I mean, you have different. So it first depends on the actual conformation of the polymer. So that induces correlation. That's clear.
Okay.
You have short. I mean, if you do something which is a short 3D excursion, if it's typically shorter than the persistence length, you will be extremely correlated, and that's completely neglected, and that completely depends on the conformation. And on top of that, you also have the local affinity for the sequence that also induces heterogeneity. And this is completely not taken into account in these kind of approaches. And you have, on top of it, you have roadblocks on the DNA, so that can randomly prevent from binding.